Welcome to this session. This session is all around the AOS-CX 10.09 release and specifically about the enhancements to OSPFv2. I'm Steve Bartlett. I'm a technical marketing engineer supporting CX switching. And this is the agenda. It's in two parts. So this is the first part, one of two, which is around the enhancements to the default information originate command. And the second part in a different presentation is the flexibility we now have concerning the administrative distance command using OSPF. So let's kick off with this item. It's around the OSPFv2 default information originate command. It's now configurable in the sense we can now configure a default metric when we want to advertise a default route using this command. As this is an enhancement, let's have a quick overview of the default information originate command and as we use it with OSPFv2. So the default information originate command allows us to configure OSPF to advertise a default route represented as 0.0.0.0 into the updates in and advertised to its neighbors. There are two options. We can use a straight default information originate syntax. This will advertise the default route of 0.0.0.0 if it is present in the routing table. And the other option is to use the default information originate always command, and this will advertise the default route regardless if it is present in the routing table or not. So we can see that config examples, one on the left and one on the right. So let's see what that really looks like. So on switch B, we've got a configuration under router OSPF1, and we put in the default information originate always. So what that means is that that route is going to be advertised out to its neighbors, and it's now taking on the cost of the path between switch A and switch B, and that pops up as a cost of 1. Now, prior to 10.9, we had no option to manipulate this metric if we wanted to change it, but now in 10.09 we can. So back to our example between switch A and switch B. So under 10.09, this is what we can do. So in the example I've got here, under our routing process, I've got default information originate always metric, and I can set it to a value of 1 to 1677214, and this is going to be configured on switch B, and I'm going to choose to configure this with a metric of 500, and that's all well and good. So what happens then is that gets advertised to the neighbors, and switch A will pick up this route with the cost of the metric changing to 500, which it overwrites the cost configured between switch A and switch B, which had an OSPF cost of 1. So let's expand on that previous but very simple example. So we've got an OSPF router network here, and we've got in core 2, we've got a static route entry representing a default route and the next hop. And we've also got the default information originate command with a metric change of 500. So that's all very good. And that propagates out to our neighbors. Every neighbor will receive that update. As you can see, from core 1 will receive it, and building 3 and building 2, as you can see, the cost now is 500. That's all well and good. And of course, now that the route is in the neighbors routing table, the adjacent neighbors to switches building 3, building 2 and core 1, but excluding core 2 as the originator, they would also receive the default route as part of the route advertisement. And the metric will be accumulated as appropriate depending on the OSPF link cost between those nodes. Let's take another example, and this time with the default information originate always command with the metric 500 configured under the OSPF process on core 2. That will get them propagated around to all the OSPF neighbors. And because the originating router core 2 is advertising a default route with the default information originate always command, be mindful that a match in the routing table is probably going to be required, of course, to forward traffic to the next hop, unless there's leveraging a process like PBR, for example, and the match could be a static route. So otherwise, the traffic will be black hole. So do be mindful of that. If you're using the default information originate, always look to work out where the next hop for the traffic will be by using PBR, or do you have a static route already configured for the desired routing. So bear in mind the default information originate feature is not designed to support this scenario that I'm about to show you. So we've got two switch routers advertising the default route, and they're AGO2 and AGO1. And of course that is now being received by Core 2, and Core 2 will populate its OSPF routing table, which is all well and good, and then it will re-advertise those routes out to its neighbors, which is exactly what we want. However, if we try to put any combination of the default information originate command, either with the metric value or without it, or the always metric 500 as an example here, it will not take. We can't do that. The key is probably recognized in the CLI syntax. Default information originate can only be applied at the routers that effectively are advertising the default route out. In this case, it's server AGO2 and server AGO1, and there we could actually change the metric on those routers. It's got obviously a default information originate command in there already. We could add to it and change the metric on AGO2 and AGO1. But we cannot do it on Core 2 because it's already received the routes from elsewhere. So therefore, the default information originate command will not work. This is normal and expected behavior, and that's how it should be. So let's have a look at some useful commands, and they're quite obvious really. Show IP route and show IP OSPF route, and of course you can extend that with specific prefixes after the command. So some more commands: show IP rib to gain a better understanding of all routes that are learned by the switch from either by dynamic routing protocols or otherwise learned from static or connected interfaces, for example. And you could look at other routing protocols. Show commands, an example here is BGP. This may be useful to understand where routes are originating from, although this is not directly related to the OSPF default originate command, but it may prove useful. That concludes this session. Thank you for tuning in.